Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Agronomists. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and great to see the comments already rolling this evening. So, hi, everybody out there in comment land. This is going to be a fun one. Yes, I feel the need for weeds. Tonight, we're talking integrated weed management, the toughest to kill, all of your trouble weeds, all of your least favorite, which aren't always the same thing. I did want to throw out there just to mention for watching this broadcast, you can, of course, apply for CEU credits. Just head to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Tomorrow morning, we'll have the post there. You can apply for your CEU credits. So please do. It definitely makes it really worthwhile doing this. We love the comments. We love the interaction, but it's really great to see that, especially without in-person events, it's nice to know everybody is getting some real value out of these nights. And so without further ado, I bring in my two guests I'm pretty excited about tonight. We've got Tammy Jones with Corteva out of Carmen, Manitoba, or near, let's say, and Mike Cowbrough, spelled funny, from near Guelph, Ontario, our Omafra weeds specialist. Welcome here, Mike and Tammy. How are we?
Great.
We are great. Thanks for having us. It's nice to see Tammy again.
Yeah,
it's been a while.
And yeah, it's really nice to see both of you. And I met Tammy for the first time about 5 minutes ago. So we go way back to the green room. I'm also going to add tonight, my internet connection is terrible and I've already been kicked off twice. And so if I disappear, I apologize. And you will hear the voice of producer Jay, the voice of God, shall boom in and follow up with all the questions. So I apologize in advance. Okay. Let's get rolling. One of the things that, of course, I noticed this week, and so, Mike, I'm going to start with you. We moved our sheep to a new solar grazing site. It is polluted with wild parsnip. It's still, of course, in the vegetative stage. Will they eat it, and will they kill it by eating it?
Huh. It's coming in hot, Lindsay. Jeez Louise. Calm it down. Well, I'll throw back a question to you. I assume they've eaten wild parsnip before and have not had any issues, right? I think the concern, from a toxicity level, the issue with wild parsnip is phytophotodermatitis, so blistering of the skin. So there has been citations in the literature of like different livestock maybe having their muzzle and their face affected, but by and large, if they consume it, it's completely fine. Quite frankly, sheep grazing wild parsnip would be probably a very good integrated pest management strategy. And the key is young and succulent, right? That's what, once, if they got into there while those wild parsnip are bolting, getting bigger, less delicate, it probably wouldn't work as well. So I think it's a great strategy. It probably won't eradicate them in the first year. It's going to take a while because there's a good seed bank there and stuff. But man, no, you're doing. What we should do is you should lease out sheep along the 401 corridor and other parts of Eastern Ontario, and we might make some progress on that particular weed.
All right. If you could figure out how we keep them from running onto the road, because gotta tell you, temporary electric fences aren't as hardy as you might think. So we'll work on this concept, Mike. Yes. And Ray asked, does Mike mean the sheep being young and succulent or the parsnips? You know what, Ray? Both. Because lamb is delicious. Okay. So, Mike, that does sort of segue in. And Tammy, glad that you're here as well, because tonight we're not just talking about, what herbicide we spray and when. No, and also sheep. It's going to come up. Totally. I regret nothing. But integrated weed management, right? So we're not just talking about herbicides, but I do want to delve into, yes, when we're using a herbicide, I really want to explore a little bit more about the timing, right? In that, depending on the weed species, spring may not be the best time, or in crop might not be the best time. And so share your experience of some of the tough to kill weeds that you're dealing with in Manitoba, and which ones might fit in that less, maybe it's a fall control plan that really needs to be part of the mix.
So I think that most of the weeds that we have in Manitoba, I blame Mike for. They're coming from Ontario and they're herbicide resistant because of Mike. That's pretty much where it ends. No, so when it comes to tough to control weeds that maybe don't suit spring timing, many of the perennials would be the ones that work into there. So Canada thistle would be a perfect example of one where we're getting lots of vegetative growth, but nothing going back down into the roots. And so we can get great top growth control, but we're not going to do a long-term management with an in-crop or an early application. A couple of others that I know that we'll probably get back to at some point in time as well would be like the horsetails. So I'm talking scouring rush and field horsetail here, not mare's tail or Canada fleabane, that sort of thing. Although that one as a spring application can also be a challenge. Foxtail barley that was emerging in the fall as well can be really hard to control in the spring in crop, especially depending on what your crop selection is. So if you can mismatch your crop and your weed, that's the ideal. Get your broadleafs out of your grass and your grass out of your broadleafs, and off you go. You're to the races for the most part. And then perennials, try and get them probably at the reproductive phase of their life is when it's easier. So Canada thistle, I like a pre-harvest or a post-harvest there. Dandelion would be another one that I look for those types of control options instead. So that's really brief.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is rotation.
Yeah. Death by 1,000 cuts. Yeah. Many tiny hammers. There's a lot of different ways of putting it. Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, the old saying used to go with things like Canada thistle and perennial sow thistle, right? If you kill it in May, it'll grow back in a day. If you kill it in June, it's still too soon. And if you kill it in July, the weed will die, right? And things like dandelion, you can use the same product, same rate, and get 20 to 25% better control if that's done in the fall than in the spring. So yeah, knowing what weed you have, its life cycle, its germination patterns, all those things. Like an old mentor of mine, Jack Alex, used to always say, figure out whether the weed's good or bad, because not all weed is bad, but know thy enemy, right? Know the time when it's most vulnerable. And Lyndsey, you mentioned on the, just to go back a bit to wild parsnip, you mentioned herbicides. Like sometimes, you need herbicides to whittle down the population to something that's manageable so that those integrated strategies are more effective, right? So if you have a sea full of wild parsnip, the reality is you probably need a selective herbicide to bring the population down so that the sheep actually do a good job of stopping it from going to seed. And then you have, your integrated approaches are going to work so much better.
Mm-hmm. So, and one of the things I want to bring up, and we are going to go to a clip relatively soon here on a really troublesome weed that came up in the most recent survey as well on one of the worst, which is Palmer Amaranth in the pigweed family. So we're not going to go there yet because what I want to talk about first, though, Mike, you did send these pictures, and I thought this was a fantastic way to talk about canopy closure. So Jay, if you can bring up some of these pictures so when we're talking about integrated weed management, we're not just talking about exactly that. So maybe it's knocking it back, or as Tammy suggested, it's making sure that we're hitting that weed when our herbicide is going to be most effective. But Mike, walk me through what we're looking at here as far as the importance of fertility and canopy closure and competitiveness.
Yeah, I think one really important concept of integrated weed management is soil fertility, and so there's two components of that, like building up to a base for soil fertility level, and then also seed and fertilizer placement. So this picture is taken by Dr. Dave Hooker at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. That's just simply in the middle, a strip of winter wheat planted in the fall, but to the right and to the left of that strip, you have in furrow or seed placed phosphorus. And I think there's another photo there later on in the spring, and that's going to be pulled up there. And again, to the left, no in furrow phosphorus. Another picture by Dave Hooker. On the right hand side, in furrow phosphorus. So quick canopy closure. If I'm from the perspective of a weed, I like the left-hand side because there's plenty of light. I can germinate and grow, or I can thrive in that environment. The right environment is not so hospitable. And so that's the placement of fertilizer, but also base fertility is important. That's work that Dr. Dave Hooker's done as well. I think for me, the most meaningful thing I ever saw was work done by Francois Tardif at the University of Guelph. He was looking at different integrated strategies. And you tend to think, oh, we'll increase seeding rates in a crop like soybeans or cereals. That'll close canopy quickly. But it was the soils that were high, like at a base fertility of 20 parts per million phosphorus, 120 parts per million potassium. They canopied much quicker than soybeans grown in soils of low fertility. In some cases, those soybeans never fully canopied during the season. So soil fertility is huge. If you want to get the crop off, like the whole point of this is to get the crop ahead of the weeds. And quick canopy closure is the name of the game, right? And so a couple of just really good examples. Like I kind of have 3 pillars around integrated pest management. Soil fertility is high on that list.
Okay, absolutely. Now I want to and Lara's going to make fun of me. She's writing up this episode, and I have a problem with, actually, it's a journey to get to the clips because we keep getting interrupted by great questions brought in through the comments. And so, but Tammy, I want to go back to you. And first of all, why do we have weeds called horsetail and mare's tail, and they're not the same thing? I would like to object. And so if somebody could fix that. But I'm kind of surprised by how many people are mentioning in the comments across platforms what a pain in the patoot horsetail is. So why is horsetail so tough to control? Why is it such a pain?
Where do I start? So if we're talking
come on, Tammy.
So the root system, if you think Canada thistle has a good root system to it, try one of the scouring rush or field horsetail scenarios. You're going down for miles and miles, it feels like, before you're going to get to the bottom of that root system. It's got no leaf really to it. There's no way to really get a good herbicide into there. The silica or whatever is making up those shoots is just ridiculous to deal with. And so any of the studies that I've seen, you really do need to have more shoot material before you get anything into there. And then we've got a couple of products. I'm not gonna lie. I might be proud of one of our products from Corteva. So the Arylex Active or haloxifin, some of the group 4s do a really decent job on top growth control. Am I going to promise you the moon and say it's going to be more than that? Heck no, because that would be unrealistic because there's so much root reserve. There's so much else going on in there. And to go back to Mike's point about the soil, it really does influence what your weed spectrum is, right? So there's indicator weeds that tell us when we have salinity. There's indicator weeds that tell us when we have some moisture problems. And usually we see that scouring rush and field horsetail coming in from a ditch somewhere where you've got some moisture issues and less crop competition. And that tends to be where it gets a foothold. Now, I warned Mike that I was going to throw this question over to him and he was going to solve all the problems of these weeds. So go for it, Mike.
Yeah, well, it's been 18 years so far and I still don't have the answer. I mean, to your point, like there's a citation from 1980 in Ontario where someone found horsetail roots at 18 feet deep, right? So it goes deep. There's a Japanese study that looked at the susceptibility of different biotypes to herbicides like glyphosate, and it varied dramatically, right? Where some biotypes were 5 times more tolerant than others. So you have a deep-rooted weed with lots of variability. And yeah, Tammy mentioned Broad Strike is another Corteva product that historically has been fairly good on horsetail, but with the caveat that sometimes it works really well and sometimes you barely notice that you sprayed it. And so that'll be the nut to crack around top growth control of that weed is what cultivars or what biotypes are susceptible and what ones aren't. And we're not there yet. And I mean, I've been talking for, I think, what seems like 5 minutes now, and I have nothing good to say. There's some herbicides that give decent top growth control. I think some of the newer E3 Enlist soybean technologies offer some post-emergent eye candy in terms of burn, but it is top growth control. It will come back. I mean, I've heard tons of different kind of ways to kill it, and none of them consistently do. So I got nothing, right? Other than maybe a backhoe and go from there.
Okay. Or like a mower, a 6-foot mower. So I'm going to say, so if we've got indicator weeds, which I do love the concept, dandelion grows in concrete. So what is that an indication of? Because good Lord, those things are hardy. Anyway, okay. They really do. All right, let's go to, this has been the 18-minute journey to the first clip. So speaking of tough to kill weeds, so horsetail, not mare's tail, because anyway, Palmer Amaranth, which that's a fun one. So Jay, if you could pull up the clip here. We're going with Burn with Jason Norsworthy, which is not Noseworthy or Northy, and it's the combination, and I keep tripping over it, so I apologize. Out of the University of Arkansas, and we're going to talk Palmer Amaranth.
This weed. Palmer Amaranth is really the weed that's had a major impact on U.S. agriculture. It's a weed that really has started off in the southern U.S. and 2005 it was found in Georgia for the first time. Glyphosate resistance was 2006. We found it in Arkansas, and basically it is spread throughout the entire southern U.S. It is a weed. I say southern U.S. It's actually starting to spread into the midwestern U.S. It's heading north, and it's been found as far north as central Michigan at this point. And it's a weed that once it's out of control, when we have glyphosate resistance in the field, we can quickly lose a field. We've had a lot of production fields throughout the Mid-South where we've actually had to till those fields up as a result of failure to control the weed.
Now you call it like pigweed on steroids.
I call it, yes, because the group here is very familiar with red root pigweed. Pigweed is very common here, so it is a pigweed. Palmer Amaranth is, and it's pigweed on steroids in the sense that in our climate it's going to grow, once it gets to about 4 to 5 inches in size, it's going to grow to 2 to 3 inches per day. So you can quickly lose control of the weed, and again, once you lose control of it, you're going to actually lose the crop.
And heading to Michigan and not too far off our borders, right?
Absolutely. And the thing about it is, again, it's not a weed that's historically been in the northern U.S. It's not a weed that you're commonly you're not going to find it here in southern Canada. But with the global society we live in today, with the transport of grain, if you take a look even at Michigan, they were buying feedstocks out of the southern U.S. Obviously, that's a major weed in our cropping system, so it was introduced into Michigan. It's in northern Indiana today, and people once said, well, it wouldn't move forward, would not move north due to the climate, but that's not the case at all. It thrives very well on these rich, fertile soils.
Now let's talk a little bit about glyphosate. Now you're a big fan of glyphosate, but it's a difficult product these days to keep. And what you're preaching really is diversity.
Absolutely. Glyphosate is the world's greatest herbicide, and as I said today, I mean, it's really probably equivalent to penicillin in terms of the impact that it's had on the global society as a whole. And in agriculture, there's absolutely nothing that would rival the discovery of glyphosate. It's a very effective herbicide, and we need to do everything that we can to continue to be able to effectively use that herbicide. And it's the key there is really diversity. At Bear Crop Science here, they say mix it up, and the more diversity we can bring into the program, the more that we're going to do to sustain the program. The reason that we're in the situation that we are today in the States is because we grew Roundup Ready crops, followed by Roundup Ready crops, followed by Roundup Ready crops, and Roundup Ready. Roundup was the product of choice, obviously, in there, and as a result, I mean, we've got a lot of acres today that glyphosate's just not an effective option for us on.
Now you mentioned a few things that growers can be doing better. First of all, better use of pre-emergent herbicides.
Yeah, and that's the real key. I think a lot of guys don't want to invest that extra money into residual herbicides, but at the end of the day, what you've got to do is you take selection pressure off of your post-emergence herbicides. Post-emergence should only be there to use to kill the few weeds that come through a residual herbicide. In our systems, what we do is we start with a pre-emergence herbicide. 14 to 21 days later, we're going to use another residual or pre-emergence herbicide, and we're going to overlay those until we get crop canopy formation. I would like to see here in Ontario at least growers beginning to start with a pre-emergence herbicide, because by doing that, again, it's going to take selection pressure off of the post-emergence products.
And full rates.
Absolutely, full rates, and I think that's really the key. We've actually done some research in Arkansas. There's been some research that's been conducted, I know in Australia, showing that reduced rates actually increase selection pressure. They increase the number of escapes, and hence they result in the selection for herbicide resistance. So people at times when products are expensive are looking at ways to cut costs, and they cut costs at times by using reduced rates, and that in itself can definitely lead to herbicide resistance. And unfortunately, there's nothing coming behind this that's really going to solve these problems if we have widespread resistance.
Now you say as well, growers have got to do a better job post-emergent spraying. Watch those weeds and spray them at the right
the right development stage, absolutely. And I think, when you take a look at some of these weeds, you can go from having a 1-inch weed to having a 4 or 5-inch weed in a matter of a few days. And so timing is very critical. Again, that's why I get back and I tell my growers in the States, we say spray dirt at times. And what we're saying there is, at the end of the day, if you spray every 14, 21 days, you're going to have some small weeds out there. You may not have a lot of small weeds, but really that's where you're wanting to target that post-emergence application. If you take a look at product labels, there's not a product out there today that's going to tell you to spray 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch weeds, and unfortunately that's where we're timing most of our glyphosate or Roundup applications. That's where we're timing most of our post-emergence products, and you're not going to be successful long term if we continue to go down that road.
I made a lot of notes, but I was also very distracted by the accent. Not gonna lie, that happens a lot. Okay, so now while I was watching it, I did make a lot of notes because there's a few things I want to unpack there. Beyond the really hallelujah moment of glyphosate and penicillin, which is really quite a claim. Anyway, we're not going to unpack that. Question here from Jennifer. Tammy, I'll go to you. Best pre-emerge treatment on soybeans if you're worried about group 9 resistance.
Oh, no, Mike's going to have this answer better than I am. Just because they have way more experience with beans. They've done way more work. This is really where it's unfortunate we don't have maybe the history. I know where Jeneth is, and corn and beans have sort of become their mainstay in that area. Not that Jeneth does. I know she has other crops in her rotation, but darn it all, there's a lot that really rely on corn and beans, and it's like a mini Ontario in that little area. So Mike, this, Fierce is one that comes to mind, but there's some upside and downside to it. There's lots out there. Maybe, throw some out from your perspective.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of a couple things to unpack there. One, you're probably never going to predict what will be the group 9 resistant weed that you have to deal with, right? You can look to the south, the immediate south of the U.S. and say, okay, they have
water
these
hemp
species, water hemp.
They
right?
are dealing water hemp 100%. Yeah.
Right. So, if water hemp is the one on your radar, also it's good, I think, as a general practice to look at what are, identify the most abundant species in each field and see if you can, kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because resistance ultimately is a numbers game. And if your predominant species is like pigweed or kochia or whatever, then it's worthwhile trying to match a soil applied herbicide that is also effective on that. In the water hemp game, yes, it's I'm going to use herbicide groups, and then I can use a couple of names. But the work done out of Ridgetown Campus, University of Guelph by Peter Sikkema is largely shown, and this works in the US as well, that kind of group 15, so like Dual, Frontier, Zidua, and then combined with group 14 herbicides, so Valterra. And so Tammy mentioned Fierce, and that's a combo of a group 14 and 15 herbicide. Authority Supreme is another one. Those are, and then Boundary Liquid is one, Strim, MTZ. There's a bunch, there's 4 or 5 that offer control of grassy weeds, some broadleaf weeds, but have activity on water hemp. So those, if your primary concern is water hemp, then you would look to use one of those soil applied herbicides.
I would like to just point out. Sorry. Go ahead, Tammy.
Sorry, we'll jump all over each other. I talk too much. One of the things that's a real challenge between Ontario and, yeah, I'll own that, between Ontario and Manitoba is this crazy border that means that a herbicide that can be used in Ontario is not registered for use in Manitoba. And there are different reasons for that. It can be some of the soil residual that makes it impossible for us to grow something. Our use rates are different at times. Our soil types are different. There's so many things. The climate is different, obviously. Look at the tan Mike has and how I don't have one at all. Things like that. So you see what
Mike
I'm saying?
has never
is
been
that
tan.
I don't, he's got the complexion for it. That could be the case. But nonetheless, we do have to make those kinds of cautions. And so some of the active ingredients that they will utilize in Ontario, we will never have access to just because of the registrations that are available in Western Canada. Fortunate or unfortunate, that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, and Tammy, that's actually what I was going to bring up was I didn't realize,
It's
because I'm from
mind-blowing.
Western Canada. Yeah, totally. I'm from Manitoba too. It's something in the water. Anyway, but I didn't realize that not only are there products registered only in the West or only in the East, but some products are registered in both, but they have different names. So just to confuse everyone, they have a different trade name between the two. So a really good shout out. Make sure it's registered and always read the label and make sure you've got the right active, for sure. Because that is one of those ones that totally threw me for a loop when I was like, what is this? Oh, I know what that is. Anyway, now we do have a couple really good questions coming in. And Francois Tardif did mention here some of the tough weeds like water hemp are probably multiple resistant anyway. And we do unfortunately have to sort of have that discussion of that realistically, depending on what you're dealing with, we know whether it's kochia or wild oats or some of the other more common ones in Ontario, several of these we have confirmed multi-group resistance, and we have to know what we have in our fields in order to deal with it. But that's actually where there is another question I want to get to in a moment. But drawing off that Palmer Amaranth discussion, I wrote down sort of some of the things that realistically back to sort of knowing your enemy of what makes a weed so hard to kill. The modes of action, of course, if they're already resistant, is one of those things. But Mike, what is it about certain weed species that make them either so hard to kill, and we've mentioned a couple of them already, or so susceptible to resistance?
Yeah, the second part, I'll probably have a tougher chance of answering that. I think where I would like to start with, because I just learned this fairly recently, to me, scouting is kind of the critical thing to identifying in each individual field and region the life cycle of a species. Like we make these broad statements about certain weeds and say, oh, well, yes, they're a winter annual and annual. And the reality is they're fluid, right? They might shift to one life cycle or the other. So I think a huge asset is your smartphone. I learned recently that if you flip up once you've taken a picture, if you flip up the picture, you can add a caption. So that could be the name of the weed, the field it's in, so that it just makes it easier to search. And I'd be throughout the season taking pictures of the weed at different stages, and also the field at different stages. And the reason I use that as a kind of concrete, actionable thing to do is I remember 2 or 3 years ago doing a study on scentless chamomile in the Niagara region. And good Lord, like that's a species that germinates throughout the season. And depending on when it germinates, will it either become an annual, a biennial, or a short-lived perennial. So we have a weed that can germinate throughout the season, has multiple ways to propagate, both roots and then seeds, and then will take on a different life cycle. And so that really is enlightening then in terms of how you're going to approach that from a management perspective. Like knowing that it's not going to work to just go in the spring, spray a burn down and hope that you're done with it, because now you're going to have stuff that's germinating in the fall that's going to be a problem that fall and next spring. So to me, kind of, we don't spend enough time on it because, quite frankly, it's not as gratifying. It's much more gratifying to kill things, right? Yes. That's why, like, probably Tammy gets this all the time. Like, someone sends you a picture and you identify it and you're like patting yourself on the back because that was pretty hard to identify. And the next question out of the mouth is, how do you kill it? And you're like, I have no idea, right? So getting that intelligence is much more, it's not as sexy, but it's so important to figuring out kind of what the game plan is around killing it, right? And so in terms of like then what weeds will become resistant and what won't, I mean, I don't know. Francois would have a better idea of predicting that, but I think we've learned historically it's tough to predict, and it's usually the most abundant one of them. It's typically more abundant species because it's just a numbers game, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like winning the lottery, only the bad kind.
The reverse.
That's right.
It's a
The
reverse lottery. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So one of the things that, of course, comes into that discussion, though, is exactly that selection pressure, right? So however many times a particular population is exposed to a certain herbicide or type of management, right? Because one of the things I always find fascinating about weeds is that just how adaptable they are. And exactly that, right? And that we have these weeds that will adapt to what your management is, right? And some of them can act more like a winter annual or more like, a spring annual or whatever, depending on sort of the selection pressure put on them. And that could be your management, your tillage, your crop rotation, whether or not you have perennial crops in the rotation, those sorts of things, but also, of course, the herbicides we use. So this does bring up, though, a question from Bryce here. Because one of the things, of course, is we need effective herbicides, and then we need to use our herbicides effectively, right? So these are two different things. But when we're talking Western Canada right now, very dry, any suggestions for trying to get good kochia control in dusty and dry conditions? Tammy, you're in the drought. You get to pick this one. We're in pretty good shape.
Rain dance.
Yeah.
That's all I have. So I think it's, it is a challenge. A couple of different reasons for that. We know that most kochia in Western Canada is Group 2 resistant. We know that about 50% of the populations in Manitoba have some level of Group 9 resistance. And we know that some of the soil applied herbicides that are effective for kochia require soil moisture so that there can be uptake of that into the plant. That being said, kochia is really great at dropping down a nice root system and accessing moisture even when none of the crop or anything else can. Based on that and the fact that this is going to go, you are going to like this answer, Lyndsey, because this is going to go back to your wild parsnip. Let it grow, hay it. You're going to be able to sell the kochia bales to your neighbor for your cattle. Because kochia, they did try to commercialize it in some places they do utilize it as a forage. So it can be used in that kind of a scenario. This might be the year where we don't actually kill it. And I mean, if you do get some seed set, usually 95% of the seed germinates next year. Hopefully it's wet next year and we can manage it then. It's a little bit flippant, but at the same time, it's actually not a bad idea this year because I don't think there's any way to make it rain. There's no way to eliminate dust. So glyphosate that can be deactivated by dust somewhat. And then the herbicide resistance side of it. I just think that we do have a couple of chemistries that can still work. Bromoxynil, for instance, would be something. So like a partner, if it's 2 inches or less, so size matters, shot glass or shorter, or 2 inches, however you want to measure 2 inches. We have some of those contact herbicides. Glufosinate will do a decent job when it's small as well. There's lots of different options that are out there. With sunshine and dry, the contact herbicides will still be effective, keeping in mind that, again, in dry conditions, something like kochia will be extremely hairy. So you have to make sure that you actually get to the leaf surface, not just mist that weed and have the chemical dry in the water droplets that are on those hairs. Just like lamb's quarters will develop a nice thick waxy cuticle as well. We have lots of weeds that'll do that. If they're not actively growing, that they're doing something, and that's usually developing a thick skin so that they can survive. And then they'll start to flower early and reproduce as quick as they can. So I tweeted out a picture of a six leaf lamb's quarters the other day, and it's not an inch tall yet, but it's just, striving to get to maturity because it's worried about where it's going. Mike, what else have you got to add to that? Any
Well,
magic?
I think you not on Kochia. I actually have very little experience with Kochia. Anytime we get Kochia, it's almost entirely in new seeded forages, and we typically blame it on seed coming from Western Canada, just as you reciprocate.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so it's good to know that not a bad forage, right?
No, it's got some
and
feed
I guess
value.
I'd be curious, Tammy, like if it is cut off, is it like most typical weeds that branch out and then flower lower, or can you actually do some good damage and stop it from setting seed?
So they did a great study in Montana, quite a while back, but when you cut it off, and I've got some pictures somewhere as well, I'll send you one for fun. It does just start to regrow. It sets seed, and between an August to whenever you get that killing frost, you can get around 4,000 seeds that'll set on a plant that would normally do about 25,000 seeds. So you don't eliminate seed production, but you do minimize it comparative to what it would have been if you'd had the full 6-foot burning bush kochia plants standing there, which I tried to commercialize as Christmas trees one year, but nobody wants them for that either.
That's
Not
so
enough,
smart.
Not a big enough hipster market, I guess, right? But
yeah.
I did want to follow up on the dry weather conditions, because it seems we're heading that way. So in Ontario a little bit, and kind of always a challenge. It's just a heads up for the season. Like if it is dry, and then you're getting into post-emergent spraying, and I'm thinking edible beans, IP soybeans, is weeds will look small, right? Because Tammy mentioned 1 inch tall, 2 inches tall, but they'll be quite physiologically advanced. Like it's not uncommon in a dry year to see an 1 inch tall foxtail that's maybe even tillered, because it's just dry. So stage kind of sometimes matters more in a dry year than size. Largely, I'd say size never matters, but
it does.
Selfish reasons.
We can agree to disagree on that one, Mike.
Yeah, it totally does. Also, anytime that we can have a field crop discussion about weeds and we bring in that we should be making hay, I'm happy. So there we go. You have made my night. Also, there's going to be a run on balers in Manitoba, just so everybody's aware. Go get yours now. Go dust off that small square baler out of the tree line. Everything's going to be fine. That is a really good point, Mike and Tammy as well. I am always amazed at the ability for a teeny tiny little plant to put up seed. They just are weed species. They have one goal, and that is to spread. And it is absolutely remarkable how quickly they can do that, or how tiny they can be, even while the rest of our crop struggles. I did want to send out a shout out to Credenza 1, which I didn't even know what a credenza was for years. Anyway, who is joining us from Australia today. So good morning. It's evening, but time is a construct. It's fine. And apparently they deal with evening primrose there. The only thing I know evening primrose for is hormone replacement therapy type things. It's like one of those, natural things. Anyway, that's all I know about evening primrose. So if anybody else has anything to say about all of it.
We have it quite a bit in Ontario. It's usually one of the first species that you see in the spring. It's the rosette is kind of a nice reddish color early in the spring. Our big challenge with it, luckily it's not, I should say we have it. It's common, but it's not too prevalent in field crops at this point, thankfully. But it's usually quite tolerant to low rates of glyphosate. So my experience is you have to kind of up the rate to have any chance of controlling it. I don't know, Tammy, what's been your experience?
I think I've got to ID it twice. Like that's about it.
Okay.
So
yeah.
very low experience.
We could do a whole other show on what is the most fun thing you've been asked to identify as far as weeds go, and see how out there they. Yeah, and I will say, absolutely, you always blame that it came in the seed from some other geography than your own. That is 100% where all of your weed problems come from. It is that bag of seed you bought from X.
Oh, I'm going to stir the pot or the water. Flooding in Manitoba used to be a thing, not this year, but some years. And and it goes to something that Mike and I that we have as a pet project, and that's keeping things clean or making sure you don't bring in the bad guys from
Yes.
somewhere else. So for me, that is equipment, lots of equipment that comes in. It used to be that at the border, it would get inspected and we'd have to be cleaner than a whistle. But even with something like water hemp or a red root pigweed seed that's so tiny, getting equipment clean is really challenging. So a lot of times the best way to fix it is just to lend it to your neighbor for the first try and then use it yourself after that.
No one ever does that. Anyway,
that's
okay,
bad advice. Very bad advice.
Really bad. We are totally kidding. Please don't send me hate mail. But we also have other problems with stuff being carried on equipment. But Mike, you did send along, and I thought this is a great segue to something that Mike sent along. So we do like to blame. We like to blame birds, which we'll see in our next clip if we ever get there. We like to blame birds. We like to blame waterways. We like to blame seed from other geographies. But Mike, you're saying that maybe we're not being as honest with our own issues, maybe as far as seed transfer goes.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of well documented that humans are the biggest mover of weed seeds, and I mean, just to share a personal story, it was 2 years ago. I had some glyphosate-resistant Canada Fleabane trials that Dan Petker, who's a farmer in Norfolk County, had set up for me. And I don't know if we have the first photo of my boot. As I'm walking through this soybean field, kind of inspecting the soybeans to see when they're ready for harvest, by the time I got out of the field, I instead of my normal 5'7", I felt about 5'7.5". I was feeling pretty tall, but yet uncomfortable at the bottom of my boot. And as I took my shoe off, like I was pretty paranoid about moving Fleabane seed around because that's the primary weed in the field, and I was paranoid about that. But and so I'd spent a bunch of time kind of dusting myself off, vacuuming the outside of my clothes, that kind of thing. But yeah, I was uncomfortable at the bottom of my boot, saw a bunch of weed seeds in there. And if we move to the second photo, I thought once I got back to the University of Guelph, why not see what's in the bottom of my boot, as one does. But I guess what I felt fascinating about this is like, there was quite a lot of pigweed seed in there. And I don't know whether it was red root pigweed or water hemp or Palmer amaranth for that matter. And I don't think I'm probably alone in terms of like, I think the canola industry's done a great job of, sanitation around club root and wearing booties and stuff like that. I almost doubt that hardly anyone, if they're walking a field for weeds and wet condition where soil can hit the bottom of your boot, that you're kind of thinking about it at all. And, the reality is we could easily be moving this stuff around ourselves. Now, thankfully, the volume of seed is not as high as say, a combine that's dirty or something like that. But still, it's, this is an easy way to introduce a species that you don't want. And so it was a real eye-opener for me to, have a good boot wash station in the car. I don't want to take my work home with me. I also don't want to take it to fields of places where farmers have entrusted me to walk it, right? So yeah, sanitation is, again, another thing that is not sexy, but super important in terms of minimizing spread.
I don't want any of those pigweed seeds. 57 seems like a lot from one boot, so keep them to yourself, Mike.
Yeah, it was quite a lot. Yeah, it was more than I thought, right? So
yeah, totally. And I'll have you know, as someone in the livestock sector, we are totally cool with biosecurity, and I keep plastic booties in my van, and I do wear them in the field when we're filming and when I go visit other farms back in the before times when it was allowed. So biosecurity
you just need good booties, though, because don't all booties more or less rip off in the field? I'm sure someone's figured it out, but...
Yeah, well, also, I don't recommend when there's a slight frost on the ground. They're very slippery. Yeah.
Slip and slide.
Super
100% slip and slide. Yeah.
Someone needs to make them like grippy, like the socks, like your grippy socks. Someone needs to make booties like that. Anyway, just putting that out there to everybody. Again, journey to the second clip. And we have brought in some of these things, but we are going to hear from Dr. Peter Sikkema and talking about controlling Fleabane, which is also mare's tail. Wait, yes.
Very good.
I got
it.
Okay. Anyway, so we're going to go to this clip. There's lots of good stuff in here, of course, but it'll bring up a couple different points that we need to tackle in the few minutes we have left.
So glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane was first identified from seed collected in 2010 in Ontario. Really interesting, over the next 6 growing seasons, glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane spread from Essex County in the southwest corner of the province to Glengarry County adjacent to the Quebec border. So in 6 growing seasons, it would move from, or it was found in 1 county originally to 30 counties. But what makes this weed even more challenging for Ontario farmers to manage is that it's both glyphosate and Group 2 resistant. So now some of our Group 2 herbicides, such as First Rate, which was our best post-control product in soybean, no longer works. This weed is native to Canada. It's considered to be a cosmopolitan weed, and that simply means that it's found around the globe, and it's found from 55 degrees north, so approximately as far north as Edmonton in Alberta, to 45 degrees south, which would be the southern part of Brazil. However, it's most frequently found in the northern temperate zones around the globe. In terms of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane, this plant grows as either a winter annual or a summer annual weed. So the winter annuals emerge in the fall, and then they form a rosette in the fall, and the stem elongates in the spring. In contrast to that, the spring emerging plants do not form a basal rosette, and stem elongates shortly after emergence. Seed from Canada fleabane, there can be up to 250,000 seeds per plant, and the amount of seeds produced is proportional to the height of the plant. So in terms of seed production, it occurs from mid-August to mid-October, and the majority of the seeds fall within 100 meters of the mother plant. But these seeds are wind dispersed, and in a really interesting study done at Pennsylvania State University, seed from Canada fleabane can enter the planetary boundary layer. And if you're not familiar with that, that's the layer above the soil surface, anywhere from 50 to 2,000 meters. And this seed can move up to 500 kilometers in one growing season. So you could have a weed escape here in Kent County. The seed enters the planetary boundary layer, and presumably it could land in the Ottawa Valley, right? And so that's what that research shows. So in terms of managing this weed, it's a much bigger challenge to manage in soybean than it is in corn. If you just think about it, fleabane is a dicot weed, and it's far more difficult to remove a dicot weed from a dicot crop like soybean than removing a dicot weed from a monocot crop like corn. In terms of where you find it in the field, so typically Canada fleabane will be found throughout a field, but it is most common on sandy soils and on those sandy knolls in your field. So typically that's where you would have the greatest weed pressure. Canada fleabane forms a transient seed bank in the soil, and most studies would conclude that the seed either germinates or degrades in the soil within 2 or 3 years after seed shed. Having said that, there's one study in the literature that has indicated that Canada fleabane seed can remain viable in the soil for up to 20 years after seed shed. So here you can see the impact of glyphosate-resistant Canada fleabane interference on soybean canopy development.
Well, if you weren't terrified before, you should be now. So thanks, Dr. Peter Sikkema, for that. That was actually from last year's diagnostic days that we did here. We did virtual diagnostic days on Real Agriculture for Ontario, which was lovely. I did want to send a shout out to Dr. Sikkema for using the word cosmopolitan and referring to the planetary boundary layer as if everyone had heard of it. So thank you. That is not something that I knew, but okay. So this though is in Ontario, Mike, one of our very large problems, right? Is glyphosate resistant fleabane. Can we get ahead of this?
Yeah, so it's certainly spread fairly quickly. I would say we're at a stage now where we have some decent options. The challenge has always been in soybeans, managing it as Peter was alluding to. Like, it has to kind of be done historically prior to planting because there's very little options post-emerge. It does speak, if we focus back on integrated weed management, there's value in having cereals in the rotation. We have 2.9 million acres of soybeans and 1.1 million acres of wheat. It'd be nice if we had 2 million of each, because it's much easier we have more options to control Canada fleabane in cereals. We have good options in corn. And so we struggle in soys, but through that work done at Ridgetown campus and also at other satellite campuses of the University of Guelph, we do have good pre-plant options to control it. So the tools exist. Usually it's implementing them before your field looks like what it does in Peter's video there. And that sometimes can be tough because you're dealing with a weed that actually doesn't produce seed that has a lot of dormancy. So if it disperses, it's going to germinate. So all that to say, like, growth can be exponential. Normally what happens is people see it, maybe 1 or 2 plants one year, and it's not enough to do anything about. So you kind of forget about it. And then the next year, maybe there's a few more clusters, but again, still you're not going to center a management plan around it. And then by year 3, you're like, maybe I should be doing something. And then usually year 4, it's a complete cluster, right? So we have options to control it. But again, like going back to integrated weed management, the reality is we have way more acres of corn and soy than cereals. And so there's, arguably over 1 million acres going into the winter that don't have anything on them. So even if we could take, 500,000 of those soybean acres and even put an oat cover crop or a cereal rye cover crop, that would go a long way to reducing Canada fleabane, because Clarence Swanton and Francois Tardif had a grad student that looked at the impact of cereals, and particularly cereal rye, on Canada fleabane, and it's another effective mode of action. So like getting that into the system would be of benefit.
Plus you can graze it. Just throwing that out there.
Well, that's right.
You can.
It's multi-purpose, right? Like if the
is.
oats, throw some oats in there, you could take it off as baleage, or cereal rye, you could take it off the next. Yeah. So, I mean, those are the things we have to do, right?
Now, Tammy, I did want to, not that I would equate fleabane and wild oats. Fleabane makes me think of kochia, but anyway, we just have different problems. Okay, Mike. But Jason has a question here about wild oats, but because it is sort of in that realm of multi-resistance and a pesky weed and shows up in patches. So Jason wants to know, how close are we to seeing Group 9 resistant wild oats in Manitoba, even though we have diversity, as Mike has mentioned? What other things can we be doing other than rotating crops and herbicides? Have you considered hand roguing? Okay, just kidding. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, of course, there's all sorts of things. To make Mike feel less bad, we also have Canada fleabane in spots in Manitoba. No glyphosate resistant or Group 9 resistance detected so far, but I do keep testing for it because someday we'll win that negative lottery as well. When it comes to wild oats, how close are we? I don't know. Wild oats are a little bit different. They're not a typical diploid. We're looking at a hexaploid there. We've got all sorts of genetic reasons why they're a little bit different. They also have fairly decent longevity in the seed bank, so you see susceptibles coming in. They're mainly a selfing, not an outcrossing weed, so that also impacts on the development of resistance, all sorts of things that are going on there. That being said, Group 1 resistance and Group 2 resistance, we're doing great jobs of selecting for that. We've done phenomenal. Manitoba's leading the way. So as far as glyphosate resistance goes, we'll probably win that negative lottery as well. I mean, we're no Australia, but someday, some way, we'll try and figure that one out. So there's other things that we can look at. One of them is something that, say, Brianne Tideman's looking at, which is harvest weed seed destructors. Certainly we see seed shed from wild oats when they're before the crop maturity. That being said, if they all shed, we wouldn't see any in our grain sample, and we know that we get wild oats there. So if we can reduce the spread by putting it through a harvest weed seed destructor, why not? Doing patch management, either silage of that area where we have heavy infestations of wild oats, altering our seeding date. If you seed just a little bit later, like instead of early May, if you seed in late May, you can reduce your wild oat population quite significantly. There is a multitude of opportunities to just tweak things a little bit in order to ensure that we reduce our wild oat pressure. That being said, I wouldn't say many of those tweaks have been done because unlike water hemp or Fleabane or some of those where the population explodes within 3 or 4 years, wild oats, 200 seeds per plant, takes us forever to build up a patch. It's like slow water torture. Someday we'll get to the point where people start to take it seriously, but for the most part, they just haven't taken it as seriously as they need to. And so maybe once we have glyphosate resistance, then the sky will actually fall.
Mm-hmm. And Lara here with Real Agriculture, shout out to Dr. Tideman with the oat panicle clipping. So there you go. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah. Okay. I mean, they sit over top of the crop, right? You can just go along and I'm sure we'll have shouldn't we have automation that does this already?
So there is the comb cut, right? There is a panicle clipper basically that can go along and do that sort of thing. It does have some effect, and that's where I think we need to go to with everything. Instead of assuming that we're going to get 90% control from a herbicide, we need 60% control from this and another 20% reduction here and something else that, gets us to where we need to be and makes it feasible to continue to do crop production. So harvest weed seed destructors are out there, panicle clippers, inter-row tillage with cameras, even on 7.5-inch row spacing. Come on. We get little drones and we get robots doing the hand weeding for us, and everything should be money in no time. Right, Mike?
It'd be fine.
Well, I mean, the challenge with all this, right, is it can be a pretty depressing, doomy, gloomy conversation, right? Like, kind of the worst talks are the resistance management talks. It's all like doom and gloom. But I think if we can wax positive for a second, I mean, the reality is that weed competition costs a huge amount of yield loss and economic loss. And so when that exists, that's a game that people look to make money off of. Like, you can make money if there's a loss of 50% yield and you can solve that problem, that's a market, right? So I think these challenges will spur innovation that becomes more cost effective and more pragmatic, right? There's always going to be that intermediate spot that's painful though, until that becomes, easier and better. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
I mean,
I just wanted to point out. So no, go ahead, Mike.
Well, it's like the harvest seed destructor thing. Like, it should be standard on all combines, but it's an added cost, and it's an added cost that right now you're probably not going to extract the value of it. Like, certainly, because we kind of looked at getting one here, and I mean, if you're a custom operator, I mean, you can't. It's not like you can charge $2 more an acre or $5 more an acre because you have a harvest seed destructor on your unit, right? So we're in that awkward stage of we're just not there yet, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe we will see that as we evolve this, and as the technology becomes perhaps more available. And I did want to point out that several times during this broadcast, there were key points where if we had livestock or in the mix, or at least at a neighbor's, we could at least help to solve some of these problems. So like you said, Tammy, 80% from this or 60% from that, I'm going to call it the weed management lasagna. And if we can layer all those pieces, and in a lasagna, you need a good bit of meat, and that's where the livestock comes in. So if we can have
I like that. I like that a lot better than many little hammers. Like trademark that.
Yeah,
because many little hammers kind of sucks.
The weed control lasagna.
Yeah, the weed control
Okay.
lasagna, and you got to have meat in it. The little hammers makes me think of like gnomes, like garden gnomes, and it just makes that's all I envision is I envision little gnomes with little hammers, and that doesn't seem like terrifying. And we need something a little bit more terrifying.
So
Sorry,
weed control lasagna is terrifying. I've missed
well,
something.
it's delicious,
Yeah, no.
so people will probably want it. So
Okay.
we're going to the good. Okay. We are out of time, which this went so quickly, which usually means it was a lot of fun, and it was. And so thank you to both of you. Fantastic questions and comments from everyone following along on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Lara likes Death by a Thousand Cuts. This has been a really great, I think, capturing. I mean, we've just covered a few things this much. There's so much more we could talk about, and we will do that again. But I think this was a really great way to sort of capture what integrated weed management can look like, and that there's so many layers to it. So Mike Cowbrough and to Tammy Jones, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
See, there you go. Francois is telling me in Australia they called sheep integrated weed management machines or something like that. So it all comes back to sheep, people. It all comes back to sheep. All right. Thanks,
I've got cows.
everyone. Yeah. Hey, cows work too. Hey, ruminants are amazing. Whether they moo, bah, just don't get goats. You cannot fence for them. Anyway, okay. Thanks to everyone for joining me tonight. Thanks to my guests. Of course, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists and sign up for those CEU credits. Next week, it is the May long weekend. I don't believe we're going to have a show, but catch us the week after that, Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Bye, everybody.